Hello, and welcome to today's live talk brought to you by Bayer, or Bayer if you are in the US. Our topic, how we can live, work, and produce with respect for planetary boundaries. My name is Melinda Crane. I'm Chief Political Correspondent at Deutsche Welle, and I regularly work in the field of climate and sustainability. So it's a pleasure to accompany you today during this podcast. The pandemic may have prompted an upsurge in online events such as this one, and for a while it also caused slightly bluer skies, but it certainly has not put the brakes pressures on our planet. It has exacerbated food insecurity and hunger in many parts of the world. The wildfires currently raging in the American West are the latest reminder that we have long since exceeded the limits of critical ecosystems. So is it time to declare a planetary emergency? Our first guest in today's talk says yes, and in a minute he'll tell us what can be done to reestablish what he calls a safe operating space for humanity. Our second partner in this dialogue will share his view of what that means for corporations like Bayer. Do planetary boundaries demand a new approach to the company's core businesses in nutrition and health? It is my great pleasure to welcome Johan Rockström. He's director of the world-renowned Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact, and he's also the chief scientist for Conservation International. He led an international team of scientists that developed the Planetary Boundaries framework that was first published in 2009. He joins us from his office in Potsdam. Good day, Johan.
Yes, good day. Hello, Melinda. Hello there.
And welcome to a man who I think for most of you needs no introduction. He's Matthias Berninger. He's Senior Vice President for Global Public Policy and Public and Government Affairs and Sustainability for Bayer. He's the architect of the company's significantly enhanced global sustainability platform, which was launched last year with a very strong leadership commitment. And he's joining us from Washington, D.C., so bright and early your time. Welcome, Matthias.
Thank you so much for having me, Melinda.
And before we start the discussion, just a quick word to all of our audience across the globe. We are very eager to hear your questions. So please do participate in the discussion using the comment function on the chat in this live stream. And as you know, we also asked you to share your thoughts prior to this discussion. We'll share the results of our poll on the effects of declaring a state of planetary emergency a little bit later on in the discussion. So let me begin with a question to Johan, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about this concept of planetary boundaries, because to the initiated it may seem self-evident, but the fact is that there's more to this idea than meets the eye. So can you tell us a little bit about the framework and its implications in your view?
Yeah, thanks, Belinda. So, and to explain that, let me just mention two kind of scientific journeys that took us to planetary boundaries. I mean, the first one is exactly in your introduction, how we're seeing that we're starting to hit the biophysical ceiling of the capacity of the Earth system to remain stable, that we see increasing turbulence that is playing out, being manifested in terms of forest fires in California, the devastating fires in Australia, the fires even in Siberia, which is now pulsing out more methane. We get more droughts and dry spells. We have, in today's news in Germany, bark beetles killing off so much of the spruce forest that we risk ecosystem collapse, which would lose large parts of carbon. So we have one tract of evidence, which is we are now no longer this small world on a big planet. We're now this big world on a very small planet. That's one strand. But the other strand of science, which concerns us scientists much more, is that we have learned so much over the past 30 years that the planet is a self-regulating complex systems that interact. So the climate system interacts with the living biosphere, and that we have tipping points, meaning that systems like the rainforest or the ice sheets or the ocean energy circulation can have multiple stable states. So they can be our best friend by dampening and cooling and delivering good to the economy and to our human well-being, or they cross a tipping point and they start self-warming and then moving in a direction that would self-amplify negative outcomes. When you put this evidence together, of course, the big research question becomes, are we at risk of destabilizing the planet? And can we, for our own future, define scientifically based, safe operating space for the systems that regulates the stability of the planet? And there you have the planetary boundary framework. So it only tries to answer two questions. One, what are the systems that regulate the state of the planet? And once those are identified, the question two is, can we quantify scientifically boundaries that if we stay within them, we can avoid crossing tipping points? But if we go beyond them, we risk moving towards this drift towards uncontrolled change on the planet. And this was first published in 2009 and has been, over the last 10 years, just being more and more, let's say, filled up with scientific evidence and scrutiny and quantifications that today, I would argue, has taken us to a point where we have very strong evidence that if we can take care of the 9 boundaries that we've identified, we stand a good chance of having a future where humanity can evolve in harmony with a stable, or I would call it manageable planet, because some impacts are today unavoidable, but at least we've not triggered tipping points. And the most important, just to close this, is that it's not only climate. Among these 9, we have biodiversity, fresh water, land, and oceans, so the living part of the biosphere, but also chemical pollution and air pollution, the human-generated particles and microplastics and chemicals that Bayer, of course, is a very important player in that domain, but also the stratospheric ozone layer. And if you look at these 9, they're not 30, they're not 2, it's not only climate, but it's not kind of completely messy with endless amounts of parameters. We today conclude that can give us a good chance of a future. We're transgressing 4 of these 9, so we are at a very serious danger point, but we have also evidence that we can turn back.
So, Matthias, let me ask you, because the sustainability strategy that you authored makes quite explicit mention of planetary boundaries. And as Johan just pointed out, a number of these boundaries are very central to your business model. So how is Bayer quite concretely acting on this new strategy and on this reference to planetary boundaries in it?
Yeah, for me, probably the planetary boundaries are one of the most inspiring models we have seen in the climate change debate and in the debate about what's going on in our planet. So when this was first published, I think it simplified a lot of discussions. We all know that sometimes people tend to try to complicate things in order to prevent meaningful action. Yeah? And I think Johan, the model you and many others have developed and further refined, leveraging computing power, plays a crucial role in keeping things as simple as they can be. When I was asked to join Bayer sometime around mid-2018, I looked at the systemic impact. Bayer is the leading crop science company with a very high market share, with an R&D budget that is much larger than most other competitors in the space, has on the planetary boundaries. Let's talk about nitrogen, for example, where we have a huge extension. And of course, nitrogen is very important for agriculture. It's the element that constitutes a lot of the fertilizers that are being used. When we talk biodiversity, when you are in crop protection, the topic of biodiversity immediately comes to mind. Land use change, deforestation, a big one. And also water. I mean, people tend to forget that the number one compound in every living being, and that includes plants, is water. So what I realized is there are only few companies that have such a systemic role in kind of driving meaningful change. And that excited me to join Bayer.
So, Johan, if we look at the planetary boundaries that are affected by agriculture, What would you expect from a company like Bayer? You have blamed agriculture as it stands now for ecosystem destruction, for biodiversity loss, and for water shortages, all of which Matthias just mentioned. So what would you expect from a corporation like Bayer on the basis of your Planetary Boundaries framework?
I think Matthias, in a way, laid it out very well, and I'm so, it's so important that companies like Bayer recognizes that you have a responsibility across so many of the planetary boundaries. And when we do the analysis, the food system is the single largest reason why we're transgressing planetary boundaries. So you could put it very simple: if we can fix the food system, we can also fix the planet. Because when we look at the numbers, 25% of greenhouse gas emissions originate from the food system, the single largest emitter. But it's also the single largest cause behind biodiversity loss, definitely on nitrogen and phosphorus overloading because of fertilizer overuse, chemicals, freshwater consumption, as you pointed out, Matthias. I mean, 70% of the consumptive water use taken out for irrigation in the world from rivers and groundwater and lakes originates for food production. So there's no doubt that food is so central to planetary boundaries. And this is a double concern because all our attention tends to be to a very, rightly on climate, because it's one of the urgency points we have, but it tends to be only about fossil fuel phase out, when in fact sustainable agriculture, to avoid deforestation, avoid leakage of nutrients, and managing soils is equally important. You could actually say today that we will fail on delivering on the Paris Climate Agreement if we fail on food. It won't be enough to just decarbonize the energy system.
So Johan, very quick follow-up on that, and then I want to get Matthias's take. You published with other researchers a study this past January in which you said that over 10 billion people could be fed in future without compromising Earth's ecosystems if we shift to radically different practices, both in production and consumption. So just give us the bullet points. What are the main things that would have to change and that are especially relevant for Bayer?
Yeah, so here you're referring to the Eat Lancet Commission reports. I encourage anyone to just Google Eat Lancet and you get the summary there. The first time you get health scientists, agricultural scientists, and sustainability scientists to define quantitatively a healthy diet from sustainable food systems. We call this the planetary health diet. It takes the best science in health, showing that to live healthy lives, we should transition into flexitarian diets with quite a radical reduction in animal protein, increase in plant-based proteins, combined with sustainable agricultural practices along the whole value chain, which means abandoning plowing for conservation tillage systems, better crop rotations, biotech, working very closely with plant protection, what Bayer represents right through the whole system. If we take all the knowledge we have on practices that exist today, so not kind of utopia, we find that, yes, we can, if people eat healthy food and take on sustainable practices, we found in that analysis that we could feed 10 billion people without expanding into destroying natural ecosystem, which is quite an important message of hope, actually. But I should say that it does hinge on us recognizing the win-win of health and sustainability in the food system. But that's a really exciting agenda where we see so much of solutions.
Matthias, that kind of a radical change on the production side, how compatible is that with Bayer's core business models? Would it require a radical rethink?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So it's a transformative challenge, and I would add one component to it, because farmers are not only contributing to those changes, they are also disproportionately suffering from it. And we can see that in Germany, where people talk about droughts and how that affects their yields and their economic situation. But of course, if you go to countries in Africa where 95% or more of the irrigation depends on rainfall, changing rainfall patterns have a devastating effect, plus all the other changes. So I would add to it that we also need to work on increasing resilience of farmers, and that requires an additional innovation agenda. So we have our hands full with transformative changes in food systems, and this requires a huge investment in research and development and a much more welcoming societal reflex when it comes to innovation. Because one of the big challenges is that we can solve a lot of those problems if we stop to pointing fingers at each other, and if we try to basically unite behind a common goal. So the Eat Lancet report, Johan, that you were part of, coined a phrase that is sustainable intensification. And that's one that Liam Condon, who leads our crop science business, is talking about every time he talks about our business. We just had a very long summer of strategy meetings at Bayer where this term came up very, very often. And sustainable intensification for me means that we need to take everything that's out there in knowledge and move food systems in the right direction. So it's not organic farming versus biotechnology. It's really taking the best of all. So we know that crop rotations, cover crops, less dependency on fertilizers is something we can take from organic farming. And at the same time, we know that the progress in genomics allows us to breed plants that are much more resilient against climate change and are much less dependent on the inputs that kind of extend beyond the planetary boundaries. For example, much less dependent on artificial fertilizers.
I have a couple.
If I may, Melinda, just re-emphasize Matthias' point here, that I think what you're putting your finger on here is so fundamental to try and break this trench war between organic agriculture versus conventional agriculture. I mean, we're all in it in the same game to transform towards sustainable agriculture. And your point about resilience is so fundamental. I actually just came back, virtually came back from Kenya, where we've been working 20 years in building resilience in small-scale rain-fed farming, which starts with what? Water harvesting. But when farmers invest in water harvesting, it opens up the possibility for them to invest in better fertilizers, better seed, better, all types of inputs. And I think you're absolutely right that if Bayer is willing to step in fully in that kind of transformation, I think that is incredibly valuable.
I have a couple of audience questions that are just coming in that are follow-up on some of the points the two of you have just been making. So perhaps, first of all, to Matthias, a question about supply chain transparency. And I know that Bayer has committed to work with its suppliers as well in this transformative process, but maybe you can say a few words about how you're doing that. And the question that's been posed by Mara Kravchenko is this: supply chain transparency is key, and in the plant-based food system, we need the right tools also to balance the demand. Look at avocado or quinoa production, which stress local communities because of the unmanageable demand from high-class society. So perhaps a few words just from you, Matthias, about the supply chain, working with suppliers, and also the point made here by Mara.
I think generally speaking, that global food systems are not only broken from a sustainability perspective in the environmental side, but also from a social side. We have a lot of smallholder farmers who are actually great entrepreneurs, because every year they kind of fight for survival. They are much more inventive than many others, but we don't give them the tools to have a much more much higher chance to kind of be successful. So for me, we need a focus on smallholder farmers. And when you look at the big crop science companies in the world, they all fight very heavily for market share with the bigger, larger, more successful farmers. They are not as focused on allowing access to their technology for smallholders. That is something that has to change. And the second thing, I think transparency on supply chains is key in the fight against deforestation. It's also key in understanding that sometimes regional products are better than products that are shipped around the world, but sometimes it's also the other way around. So they really give data that allows us to make better decisions. One of the big problems when it comes to food is the debate turns very quickly, very emotional, and as a result of that, data loses out. And we need good data, we need science in order to find the right solutions here.
Great, thank you very much. And here are a couple of questions that are relevant to the points you've made, Johan, coming in from Cassiana Bilanca Viragino. I hope I've said her name correctly, and she's in the Philippines. So her first question is about the recommendations for plant-based diets and whether these diets are really sustainable given the impact on water, biodiversity, and energy requirements to extract enough protein from plants. So that's question number one. And the second one is that there has been arguments that the Eat Lancet recommended diets are too costly, especially for low-income countries, because vegetables and fruit are so expensive in many of these, including the Philippines.
Yeah, thanks, Cassiana, for those questions. Really important one. The first on plant-based diets. Perhaps I should explain that what the Eat Lancet report concluded, based on synthesizing the latest health science, is that if we want to live long, healthy lives and avoid diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, so trend lines on non-communicable diseases, a flexitarian diet has the best outcome. And that is a diet that goes down to 5 animal protein servings per person per week. So it's not a vegetarian diet. It has 1 serving of animal protein, 2 with chicken, and 2 with fish. So it's largely going back to where we were in the 1970s in the US or Europe, and it's roughly where the Mediterranean diet is today. It has, yes, a much more larger portion of fruit, vegetables, and nuts in particular. This is a big challenge. You're putting your finger on this, Cassiana, that it's not obvious to have access to that level of plant-based vitamins and protein. But we do see, when we look at different compositions of small-scale farming communities in the developing world, that they have a lot of local vegetables that can be locally produced and kind of compensate for that portion. And then let me close by saying that actually plant-based diets tend to be much more energy efficient than animal-based diets. The average convergence is roughly 4 to 5 units of plant-based carbohydrates for 1 unit of animal protein carbohydrates. So there is a possibility, both from a climate and also from an energy or dietary perspective, to be much more efficient. For example, instead of using your wheat or maize to feed a cow, you can eat it directly, and you can get 5 times more edible proteins and carbohydrates or kilocalories to as a person. But I should also say that the Eat Lancet Commission was very clear. Around the world, so many, I mean, we're talking 3-4 billion people depend on livestock. Livestock is an integral part of the farming system, just like Matthias emphasized small-scale farming. It's integrated crop and livestock. Livestock often is the insurance factor in families, so it plays a role and will continue to play a role. And ruminants are fantastic converters of grass into edible animal-based proteins. So it's not ruling out animal protein in any way, but it's just recognized that overconsumption has negative impacts on health and on environment.
On the topic of meat, I'd also like to kind of contribute 2 or 3 things. So first of all, I agree with everything you said, Johan, and again, you have the data on your side. So we know that the environmental impact of proteins that we consume via slaughtering animals are much more energy intensive on balance than proteins that plants deliver. What I see as a challenge for us is that more and more people become wealthier than before, which is a good thing. We want to fight poverty. As a result, their demand for meat goes up unless there are cultural kind of blocks to that, like in India, where people do not want to eat as much meat for other reasons. But my general observation is we have to accept that and therefore work even harder to balance diets where meat is currently consumed in too high amounts. So we have to recognize that the meat demand will go up in the world, and therefore we need to work even harder on having this discussion. Secondly, what I really find a great sign is that a lot of the large meat producers look at the environmental impact of their value chain. They talk to us about how can we reduce, for example, the carbon footprint of corn production or the general environmental impact of corn production in order to reduce the overall effects we have. So something is happening here. And what excites me most are the business possibilities in the vegetable space. So Bayer is the largest has the largest offering of seeds in the vegetable space. Actually, our most valuable seeds are like tomato seeds. Yeah, they're worth more than gold if you compare that. And we invest in innovation like vertical farming, which is really exciting because more and more people live in cities. And if you want to change diets in cities, vertical farming is one of the innovations that allows us to make that change happening whilst reducing the footprint of the production, even in the seed and vegetable space.
I want to come back in just a moment to the role of innovation, but I do have one question here about, so to speak, about what's happening in the vegetable space, and it goes a little bit further afield to the market structures within which smallholder farmers are working. So it's a question from Rosemary Gathage, and it's this: how can you help farmers in Africa getting good, sustainable markets, since production of vegetables here is easier, but we get surplus, like now we are throwing away tomatoes. And I think many of us have seen those pictures of tomatoes rotting by the sides of the road. So Matthias, maybe you want to say a word to that, or Johan, either?
Yeah, and I think that's why when we talk about food systems, we talk about really complex systems. So this transition will only work if we are able to not only produce healthy foods on the field, but create a whole supply chain that allows those vegetables to ultimately meet markets, be it markets in the richer countries or be it markets in the poorer countries today. And the improvement of storage capacity, the improvement of supply chains, the investment in rural infrastructure is key. Ironically, we are so focused in development about cities because there are more and more people moving to cities that we are losing sight of how important investment in rural infrastructure is. By the way, that's not only a developing countries problem. If you think about digital technology in countries like Germany, we need to invest in rural digital technology to allow farmers to leapfrog into digital agriculture. And that's really crucial for the change in the food systems. Secondly, we have to make sure that we protect farmers in those poorer countries when they build businesses against dumping imports. That's a problem that I find also really sometimes even disgusting, that we work hard to build value change in the poor countries in the world, and then basically leftovers of the productions in the richer countries destroy those systems. So we have to be really careful not to destroy the opportunities for the farmers just because we don't think hard enough about what's happening.
And Matthias, are you able in your work, I mean, I know you're based in Washington, you're doing a lot of work in the area of also political communication. Are there things you can do in your own personal work to make sure that these issues are on the agenda and that to the extent possible that you can help to shape those market structures?
I mean, for me, companies have to take a clear stance on certain topics. So you can't say you are in favor of the outcome of the Paris Agreement, but then not change your own value chains in line with the insights that led to the outcome. So I believe that, and there are lots of our competitors who move in the same direction. I believe that the crop protection industry needs to firmly stand behind that change to sustainable intensification. And that sometimes means that we have to have quite difficult conversations with political supporters who like farming, but they don't see the link between farming and climate change in the way we see it. But having a clear stance, being very clear what the science is, supporting science on the one side, and on the other side, avoid the politics that just kind of swirls and swirls and swirls. A lot of the time it's like modern farming or organic farming. I think replacing that word "or" with the word "and" in the political debate is one of the key success factors for us to ensure that we have enough political support for change in a very short time frame, because we don't have much time. We are running out of time, and that's something farmers experience every growing season.
I want to come back to agriculture and drill deeper in just a moment, but let me first zoom out a little bit, because again, Matthias just mentioned change and the fact that we don't have a lot of time. And in fact, Johan, after the COVID lockdowns, we saw a drop in emissions, and we heard some voices saying, hey, this is a lesson that actually we can get by on lower growth. So I know that you have called this pandemic a potentially transformative moment. In what sense do you mean that?
Yeah, let me first, I don't think disappoint you, but just to say that I don't see the environmental improvements that came with COVID-19, reductions in emissions, clean air in many cities, reduced pressures on some ecosystems as anything that we should celebrate. I think it's rather the contrary. I think there's a big risk if particularly NGOs around the world start giving the impression that we need something of a COVID-19 type shock to be able to save the planet. It's like, okay, so we have to basically ruin the economy, lose our jobs, then we can potentially do something good. But what it does show are two other things. And number one is it shows the magnitude of the transformation we're facing, because it's quite interesting that COVID-19, without having any intentions, has led to roughly 6 to 8% reductions in emissions, which happens to be roughly exactly the annual pace we now need to follow over the next 30 years to have a chance of avoiding crossing tipping points. So what we unintentionally have accomplished during these last 6 months is what we have to do intentionally through innovation and transformation. So that's a lesson. But the most important, why I call this a transformative moment, is we've put $11 trillion on the table. We have recognized that it's a resilient recovery we're talking about. We recognize that we can, in just a matter of days, have 7.7 billion people rise. I mean, again, I was quite recently in rural areas and in Kenya, and it's just incredible to see that in the furthest out and in the Machakos villages, people walking around with masks and being fully aware that we have a global crisis. We have this ability to rise that I think many of us didn't even think was possible. And when you think of the numbers, all the climate science analysis shows that something like 1-2% of global GDP, meaning $1-2 trillion per year, would be enough to kickstart a full transformation towards a safe operating space for humanity on Earth. We put 11 trillion on the table to kickstart the economy after COVID-19. So we're talking of magnitudes in the economy that are fully available. I would even argue that after COVID, we can no longer ever again have a fight over how to fill $100 billion in the Global Climate Fund or fill $1 billion in the Global Environment Facility. I mean, that's complete peanuts compared to the 1,000 billion or trillion that we put for COVID recovery. So I think it's like we've gone through this crisis bath that allows us to think big, like Matthias says, step up to systems understanding, and then quite frankly, to just recognize once and for all that we are the big world on a very small planet. What happened in a wild market in Wuhan created a crisis across the whole planet. What happens in the Amazon sends invoices also. What happened in Greenland also sends invoices. In Antarctica also sends invoices. That's why we have the worst fires ever recorded in California. These are planetary invoices coming from different spots of mismanagement across the world. It's exactly the same thing. And I think that lesson, I hope, is transformative for us.
So speaking of transformation, let me bring in the results of that poll that we took prior to this podcast. And we had nearly 1,000 people taking part in the poll. And the results are this. We asked our audience, declaring a state of planetary emergency, and then we gave them 3 options to finish that sentence. So 62% said declaring a state of planetary emergency would catalyze meaningful action. 22% said it could spark fear and defeatism, and 16% said it would basically make no difference, essentially, because tipping points have already been reached. So, Matthias, let me start out by asking you for your thoughts when you hear those results.
Yeah, that kind of is right at kind of the 2 worlds I lived in, the political world and the business world. Yeah, so in the political world, you always think about, okay, what's going to happen when you create a kind of a state of emergency? What's going to be the adverse effects? I've spent a lot of time looking at the data, and also in the business world, people spend a lot of time looking at the numbers. So one of our biggest investors, for example, BlackRock, has changed their position on climate change by just looking at their portfolio and how the changes in climate kind of threaten their ultimate goal, and that is to be a good steward of the money people invest in them. So what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the numbers, when you look at what Johan is looking at, the science, you realize that this is almost like no question anymore. We are beyond the question whether we are in an emergency state. The question is, are we able to act in accordance to what we know? That's the big question. And for me, the good news of COVID is that the climate debate did not go away. Yeah, normally something new happens, especially in a country like the United States, and the old news is gone. This didn't happen with COVID. What COVID brought was a heightened attention that half of the world doesn't have access to health. So it added to the debate, I think, in a very good way, but it didn't take away from the climate debate. And we are in a stage of emergency, whether we declare it or not. Our own customers, farmers, large and small, tell us that every day. Ask somebody who tries to grow cotton in Australia whether there's a state of emergency. Ask farmers in Africa who are actually trying to fight a little insect, the fall armyworm, and literally lose the food on their plate. Or ask farmers in South America who have less rainfall because the rainforest is disappearing. By the way, it's called rainforest for a reason. It's very important for all the water cycles in the world. So for me, the emergency is there, the data shows it, and I think both politicians and business leaders need to act, because that's what we are actually getting paid and elected for, and not for trying to pussyfoot around what's going on.
So Johan, you have said it is time to declare a state of planetary emergency. Are you concerned that some people might shrug and say it's all too much, there's nothing to be done, that people get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis?
Of course, Melinda, that is a risk to take seriously. But let me lay out a few pieces of evidence first here. I mean, the first, I think, which is worth reemphasizing, adding to Matthias' point, that why declare a state of planetary emergency? Well, to begin with, has it ever been done before? The answer is no. Is it serious? It's very serious. Will it ever be done again? I would argue no, because either we solve it or there won't be another reason to declare it, simply because then we are on a drift away towards something that will be permanent emergency. So it's a very serious stance. I mean, science has been very careful. It took us several years to come to this point where we said that now is a time to seriously consider declaring a state of planetary emergency. You may know that 100 countries and cities have declared a state of climate emergency, but we think it's a planetary emergency because of all these interconnected systems. Now, what constitutes an emergency? Well, it is risk multiplied by time. So Matthias has a key point here that you only declare an emergency if you have unacceptable risks, which we have unequivocal evidence that we are facing, but also if you're running out of time. So science has been warning for 50 years, but we have always had time. There's always been, many decades ahead of us, but now we are unfortunately forced to remind everyone that, dear friends, we've entered the decisive decade. This is the decade where we either turn things around or we pass on to our kids a planet that we can no longer ensure can remain stable. So that's just to explain why emergency. And I have to do that because then that explains why, of course, when you declare a stance of emergency, the reason you do it is to mobilize action. It is to have a concerted rise to solve the problem. So in any other emergency, you never kind of consider, let's not care about having an emergency declaration in the California fires because it might simply lead to passivity, to passive defeatism. Of course, there's a slight risk of that, but the purpose of it is to mobilize action. And we see psychological research that increasingly is showing actually that we've made a mistake in the past. It's often been very popular to claim, not based on any evidence, that we should not scare too much when it comes to climate and the environment. That has proven wrong. It's actually been shown now in climate psychology that it actually gives more energy, that frustration and adrenaline is actually quite positive as a force to rise, just like the Fridays for Future are kind of a manifestation of. So of course, a certain portion of population will become afraid and perhaps passive, but the majority, I would argue that the science shows will rise if one recognizes the unacceptable risks we're facing. And that's why I felt that your poll was very reassuring. I found 62% showing that this would catalyze action is exactly in line with this climate psychological research. So I think there's always differences, of course, among human beings, but I just want to make that clear to everyone listening here that the purpose of declaring a planetary emergency state is to have that as a point for thinking out of the box, taking Matthias systems thinking, and then going big. Just what COVID-19, going big. I mean, it's like an Earth shot. It's not the moon landing. It's the Earth landing. To get things in scale.
I would like to talk a bit about the feasibility of what we are talking about here, and just with one very concrete example. So a year ago, we decided that we need to decarbonize our own production and also our value chain. And of course, this looked like a big thing. Yeah, when Ursula von der Leyen declares for the European Union that the goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 55%, this looks like, oh my God, what's going to happen? It took us a year to kind of calculate what that means. And I think one thing Bayer is really strong at is really doing the math behind what's going on. I mean, this company wouldn't have existed for such a long time without this very strong muscle. And in the case of Bayer, to be in line with the Paris Agreement, to be carbon neutral by 2030, and to further decarbonize in our value chain by 2050 is totally possible. So we need to invest a lot. It's 700 million over 9 years to be in line with the 1.5 degree goal of the Sciencebased Target Initiative. But 700 million is not an amount of money that a company couldn't invest in. So often, intentionality is what's missing. It's not the mountain that you can't get around. And for those companies who cannot avoid carbon emissions because it's part of their value chain, think about the building industry, cement industry, but for those companies, offsetting models, for example, offsetting models where farmers would benefit from taking carbon out of the atmosphere and would get rewarded for it, can help to achieve that. It all requires this combination of innovation and intentionality that, in my book, will lead to quite surprising positive results. I can see that researchers, if they are all moving in the same direction, will get us out of this mess faster than we sometimes fear it would be. And that's why I'm a climate optimist. I believe that's entirely possible. I believe the humanity has done difficult things before. It's not like that it's the first time that we run into a difficult situation. And when you break it down to an action on company level, it suddenly doesn't look as bad anymore as it looked at the outset.
Let me just pose one question to Johan that's coming from the audience about the role of governments before we dig a little bit deeper on the corporate role and particularly those science-based targets that you just mentioned. So I want to come back to that in just a moment, but I do have a couple of questions coming in from audience members on government and its role. So one is Diego Fernandez, who says that governments play a role in moving forward with this agenda and how we can accelerate that, not only from an economic but also a social perspective. And then we have a second question sort of related. Ensure that key decision makers act on the planetary emergency if in fact it were declared. So essentially, Johan, what we can do to galvanize accelerated action from governments, because we are not where we need to be if we want to reach those 2030 targets.
Yeah, no, that's right. And let me start that by just connecting back to Matthias, who made a very important point. When I was saying that declaring a state of plant emergency can trigger action, it will only work if it's combined with also communicating solutions. So of course, on your poll, I think it's very dangerous to just declare emergency in complete isolation. You have to, if you do it, you have to announce what's then the path that we take to solve the emergency. So that's said. And as you say, Matthias, many times those solutions are at hand. So I'm absolutely convinced that the business sector in the world plays a fundamental role and is one step ahead often of the political leadership, but without the political leadership, we won't get the transformations we want. So we need to have political leaders across all countries in the world to align behind the science. Now we are in a very dire situation here because we're almost in an all-time low in terms of trust between nations, and it's not very helpful that we have the most powerful economy in the world stepping out of the Paris Climate Agreement, for example. So this is a big concern. On the planetary emergency declaration, we actually introduced this in the United Nations General Assembly. So we had a heads of state dialogue the first time we presented it, having Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for example, but also Frans Timmermans of the European Union. So we'd like to bring this into the Security Council of the United Nations. I mean, highest up in the UN system, to say that security for humanity is not only about avoiding armed conflict, it's also about being stewards of the planet. It's not an environmental issue anymore, it's a security issue. And that's the aim. So anyone with good ideas, please help us here. But so the question is really well posed. It has to be anchored politically. And I think getting the political leadership to kind of help in setting the boundary conditions within which the business then and communities can succeed. I mean, I think that's the key.
So Matthias, now a question also from the audience in relation to innovation, which you've just stressed rightfully, the enormous importance of innovation as one of those solutions from the corporate side. Of course, government's also playing a role in fostering innovation. But here's the question coming from Shweta Godaj, hopefully I said that name correctly. Though biotechnology can play a crucial role in increasing plant-based nutrition, still some countries are skeptical in accepting transgenic crops. How to tackle that situation?
Yeah, not only some countries, but whole continents. Yeah. So if you think about the European Union, there's a huge level of skepticism. If we did a poll today, we would probably have 4 out of 5 people saying we object to that. So for political decision makers to allow innovation to come to the front is very, very hard. And some people have climbed very high on the tree, and for them to kind of climb down is very difficult. But what's happening where biology or genomics meets computing power or artificial intelligence is, for me, akin to the invention of book printing. And there's a very important lesson. When book printing was invented, it spread at the pace of an ox car across the European continent, and it then arrived in Istanbul. And in Istanbul, it was rejected. Was that the end of books? Istanbul was the scientific center of the world back then, or was it the end of Istanbul being the scientific center? So I believe what's possible in the area of the biorevolution will succeed. I also believe for Europe, a key question is, does Europe want to be part of this and shape it, or just be a bystander that later on has to accept that the rest of the world moved on? That's the big question. For businesses, it means how can we make sure that scientists participate in a real way in that consumers are informed about what's going on, and that we focus the research on solving the problems that are related to planetary boundaries and not just one dimension, for example, productivity. That's our responsibility. But I think the responsibility of many others is to follow the science and to overcome the temptation to kind of just play on the societal mood against certain technologies because they're fearing things. Fear is not a good advisor, neither for whether climate change is a problem, nor for whether you allow innovation. The other thing, though, is it's not only about biotechnology. I said earlier that we can learn from organic farming a lot about crop rotation, a lot about cover crops, and it's about social innovation. When we talk about helping smallholder farmers to be more successful, we are talking in the majority about women. So the focus on how to help smallholder farmers is one that enables women to better care. Also the social innovation part that we need to look at.
One quick follow-up to you with the request for a very quick answer, because we don't have a whole lot more time on the clock, and I do want to get 1 or 2 questions in about the science-based targets. But here's the question. Sandra Stoffelshaus asks, who has to make campaigns and education to customers and clients so they understand how big and interconnected this all is? She says climate change, but in fact, the planetary boundaries themselves. What's Bayer's role in that, in really trying to put those facts out there and create a kind of an educational campaign, both for your suppliers, your customers, and others?
I think a very important role businesses have, including Bayer, is to be transparent. So we have 8,000 scientific partnerships around the world. I think people have a right to know with whom Bayer partners. And wherever business has been kind of cagey about that and tried to influence without being transparent, problems occurred. So I think our first and most important role is to be transparent about what we are doing and why we are doing it. There will be innovations that are highly controversial to solve those problems, but we have to be transparent about why we are doing that and what the effects are in the context of sustainable intensification. And the other thing is, rather than fighting science, businesses should just embrace it. So, and that goes back to the oil industry. I mean, there is no point in arguing that climate change is happening. There is no point in playing those holdout games to protect former business profit pools. This is all about embracing what we know, and we know more than we need in order to act.
So that is exactly the bridge that I'm going to take to come back to Johan with a question about those science-based targets that you both mentioned. So you are working with a new partnership, the Global Commons Alliance, on a playbook of science-based targets for companies that will come out later this month, as I understand. Can you tell us more about that, how that would work, and how you're going to work with the corporate sector to get them on board with the playbook?
Yeah, no, this is really exciting. So And then let me just draw it back to 2015 and the successful signing of the Paris Agreement. I mean, behind the scenes, I think it's well established today that the business community in the world played a decisive role in getting the political leadership to sign on to the legally binding Paris Agreement of staying well below 2. That translated very quickly, with support of science, to a global carbon budget, which became the so-called Science-Based Target Initiative. And the Science-Based Target Initiative is a business network coordinated by the UN Compact and the World Resources Institute to basically operationalize the Paris Agreement in businesses, to provide a science-based target. Where do you need to be with your mitigation on 2030, 2040, 2050? Now, we, inspired by this, then together with the World Economic Forum and the Global Environment Facility and a whole group of partners, established the Global Commons Alliance to take the planetary boundary science and translate that to science-based targets for a stable planet. So basically go from SBTI to full SBTs for the whole system. And we're right now working very closely with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, with the World Economic Forum, with networks of companies to connect science with business, to develop science-based targets for all planetary boundaries for company in different sectors. And I think that's a bit of the missing piece here, because as Matthias represents, Bayer is so far ahead of the political agenda, but you need the political agenda for regulations and the overall agreements and the conventions. But how do you then translate that to scientifically based guidance in the business, in the boardrooms, in the management decisions? And that's what the science-based targets for planetary boundaries is attempting to do. So it's not a legally binding provision at all. It's a kind of voluntary science guide for business. And what we're hoping is then to move sustainability away from corporate social responsibility to be at the core of the business model, to be really guiding, be on the CEO's table, be on Matthias' table, at every day you wake up.
So if I can take this over to Matthias, because in fact it is on your table in a different sense. Bayer has established its own targets for core areas, but it's often said that a company that moves first and on its own faces potential competitive disadvantages. So would broad-based targets like this be helpful for Bayer in terms of not having that first mover disadvantage?
So we looked at what is the right framework for decarbonization? And we looked really hard at it, did a huge work of analysis, and we ended up that the Science-Based Target Initiative is the best way for companies to go. There is no need to invent another one. It's good enough to drive decarbonization. And when we submitted our 1.5 degree target just last month, we had a clear framework how to do that. And we have checks and balances. We have experts that are not paid by Bayer checking whether we are doing what we are doing. And that's important for our investors. Most of our investors want us to invest in decarbonization. So the invisible hand of the market turns green. And what the Science-Based Target Initiative does is it defines a path for how much you have to reduce carbon emissions in your own operations. It's more than 40% within 10 years. And how much you have to reduce the carbon emissions in your value chain. Often there is much more carbon emissions outside of your own factory gates. And in this case, it's way more than 10% reduction that we need to require from our suppliers to declare that we have a science-based target. The framework works. Let's work the framework is my ask here. And the other thing we need to do is we need to reward business leaders for doing that. At Bayer, 10% of the salary of the leadership depends on achieving carbon neutrality by 2030. So long-term incentives are aligned with the sustainability goals.
One last super short question, because I think we're just about out of time. You've both said that you see yourselves as climate optimists in a sense. We had a question at the very outset of this live stream. I think that it was also from Diego Fernandez, who said, 3 of the planetary boundaries, at least 3, have already been overstepped. Is it even possible not simply to stop the progression of overstepping, but to actually reverse it? Are you optimistic enough to say yes to Mr. Fernandez? Johan?
Yeah, so my short answer is yes. But I think it's important to just qualify that yes to say that unfortunately it's too late to return to a planet which would be equivalent to the pre-industrial state, a more stable state of the planet. So we have come to a point where we, whether we like it or not, will face what we can call a manageable planet. So we need to invest more in resilience because we'll have more forest fires, more heat waves, more droughts, more floods, more sea level rise, inevitably, even if we are able to stabilize climate below 2 degrees Celsius. But the window is still open to succeed. It's equally dramatic to protect nature as it is to decarbonize the energy system. These are equally important, and the coming decade is decisive. But the window is still open. And of course, some scientists claim it's too late, but the majority claim
I said I'm a climate optimist, so decarbonization is certainly possible. I think technology has moved forward. In the United States, despite an opposing position of the government, this year renewable energies have exceeded coal as an energy source. But I want to give 2 other examples. If we achieve sustainable intensification, we can reduce the pressure on land use change, very important for biodiversity. And if we empower farmers through new farming methods and better biotechnology to ensure that soil and plants can take nitrogen out of the air rather than via the Haber-Bosch process through like artificial fertilizers, we can massively improve the situation when it comes to nitrogen circles. And this is possible. Innovation in that space is possible. I've spoken to so many people who are doing breakthrough research in that space. So yes, if we are full on an innovation, we will get out of this in a fairly good way. Unfortunately, a lot of people will suffer the inactivity of the last 20-25 years. That's something we also have to always bear in mind. So we have to help people. We have to be open, for example, to climate refugees. We can't let those people suffer the consequences of our inactivity.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I'm told that we can ask one last question, but it's got to be very, very short. So here's my question. What each of you are doing in your own personal lives to live within planetary boundaries, and whether there's something that you are now doing differently than you might have done it 5 or 10 years ago. Johan?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a continuous struggle. I and my family are in no way perfect, but we think about this and try to live as sustainably as we can. A few concrete examples is that it's already almost 20 years back now that we transitioned to 100% renewable energy for all the heating and electricity. Very easy to do in the Nordic region, so wind power in full. We have just one car, and it's a biogas car. I cycle, I'm a cycling nerd, but trying to reduce, fossil fuel-based transport as much as possible, and take care of consumption patterns. So, carrying out a climate budget, which is easily done by apps that are downloadable today, and help within the family. And we're thinking ourselves of following the carbon law of cutting emissions by half, because anyone can do that. You can do it as a company, but you can also do it as a family or as an individual. So that's the plan. But again, it's not easy to be sustainable in the societies we live in today.
Thank you. Matthias?
Yeah, for me, first thing is probably follow the lead of my daughters, and that is less meat consumption, especially less red meat consumption is helping. I also had a little moment when we started the solar panels on the roof of my house in Washington. That was a great moment. So perhaps people flying over high in position see more and more of those solar panels, and it changes something in their thinking. A lot of people had a good job with that. And then I think air travel is the big one. Yeah, for me, certainly air travel is the big one. COVID has taught us that we don't need to travel as much to be effective. So even after the pandemic, I think there will be less business conferences, less travel, more technology like we use today. And to sustain that change is probably very important. The good news, Johan, is I'm also a cycling nerd. So this year I have more bike miles than air miles, which is a new experience, at least since I can remember. That wasn't the case.
And I will weigh out by saying I too am a cyclist, and actually I moved from a house on the outskirts of Berlin into the very center so that I could ride my bike exclusively, and it's a joy. You talked about the importance of virtual technology, Matthias. Well, in fact, this virtual technology has allowed us to have 6,500 people with us on this live stream from over 50 countries around the world, ranging from Taiwan to the US, Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Finland, Chile, Ecuador, Romania, Myanmar, Spain, and China. So I would say a truly, truly global event to talk about the planet's boundaries. Many thanks to Johan Rockström for being with us from the Potsdam Institute. Many thanks to Matthias Berninger from Bayer for calling in so early from Washington, D.C. It's been a really thought-provoking, inspiring dialogue with the two of you. So I will also say thank you to all of those who are following us all around the world, and we hope to see you again soon on the next podcast. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye there. Bye, everyone.